Hey Sit and Spin fans, hello and welcome to another edition of Sit and Spin with Joe, where today we are counting down the top 10 rock and roll / music movies of all time as chosen by you, our viewing and listening audience. I think we had like 80 submissions in all, different votes for films from the rock and roll music / genre, and there were a lot of people who were nominating concert films and documentaries, and while I agree those are absolutely rock and roll movies, for the sake of just doing like the real like kind of more story movies, I am going to exclude those because really those things deserve a poll of their own. So further on down the road we'll have a top 10 poll for concert films and another one for rock and roll documentaries, because I mean I think I've seen at least 10 great rock and roll documentaries just this year alone, and that's saying something. But anyway, back to what we're here for today. The whole subject of this came up because one of my top time all favorite rock and roll movies, which we'll see how it fared in the polls, came out on Blu-ray for the first time today, and that being That Thing You Do. Absolutely love this movie. One of the great things about the Blu-ray is that it has both the theatrical and the extended cut of the film. The extended cut has at least half an hour to almost 45 more minutes of footage that goes further into depth into the characters. Great movie. Great soundtrack. We'll see where this fell into the top 10 shortly. But let's get to the rest of the top 10. Coming in a three-way tie for number 10. And I let the tie stand just because there are so many good movies. I wanted to get in as many as possible. But we'll stick with just 10-ish for now. 13 technically. First up we've got Walk the Line, which is a Johnny Cash story starring Joaquin Phoenix. Great movie. Great biopic pick about Johnny Cash, and anything by Johnny Cash is good with me because you can't go wrong with The Man in Black. And my dad actually played bass in Johnny Cash's Air Force touring band back in the day, so extra bonus points for me. Next up, as part of the three-way tie, we have School of Rock, featuring Jack Black, a little comedy directed by Richard Linklater, who also directed one of my all-time favorite films in Dazed and Confused. But this movie is great too, features some pretty cool soundtrack as well as do all of these movies. And lastly, rounding out our three-way tie, we have Singles, movie directed by Cameron Crowe about the Seattle scene in the early 90s. It's kind of like the grunge music scene. Members of Pearl Jam and Soundgarden also have little cameo roles in this movie, as well as Alice in Chains doing a little concert footage. Great soundtrack to this one as well. And Cameron Crowe, he's a director we will see turn up in this little thing again. Coming in at number 9... That Thing You Do. We've already talked about it. What more do we need to say? Go out and get it. It's awesome. Coming in at number 8, an all-time classic rock and roll musical, Grease, starring John Travolta and Olivia Newton-John. Who hasn't seen this movie or listened to the soundtrack? You know, every girl I've ever known or dated, they have the soundtrack or had the soundtrack in this collection. You probably still do. You know it. You know it's true. Grease. Chicks love it. Guys, too. Coming in at number 7, another biopic pick, The Doors, directed by Oliver Stone, starring Val Kilmer and a bunch of other great people. I don't want to go on the names because it's too many to try to remember. But Val played Jim Morrison, and all the scenes where you see Val singing live, that's Val. It's not Jim. It's actually Val Kilmer. Pretty cool. Coming in at number 6, classic from the 80s, Purple Rain, starring Prince, and sort of kind of true to life story about Prince, but great concert footage from this. Most of the soundtrack for this movie was filmed live and worked on live when they were making this movie. If you ever get to see, get the DVD or the Blu-ray, you watch the behind the scenes footage on this. Lots of great stories, really cool as well as that. Coming in at number 5. How much rock and roll can you get then? Rock and Roll High School, starring the Ramones. Classic film. The Ramones are great. Paul Driscoll, you know you are loving this. Cool little behind-the-scenes tidbits. Before the Ramones agreed to do this movie, it was actually offered to Cheap Trick first. That would have been a different flick. And as much as I like Cheap Trick, I'm glad it was the Ramones. Coming in at number 4, this one was really a surprise to me as to how far it got, because while I like this movie quite a bit, a lot of people think it's really cheesy, and in a way it is, but I lived through this scene, so I remember it fondly. Rockstar, starring Marky Mark himself, Mark Wahlberg, and there's a funny little bit at the very end in the closing credits where they actually bust out a Marky Mark tune, Good Vibrations. Hilarious. But lots of also famous musicians starred this one. Jason Bonham, Zakk Wylde, Blas Elias from Slaughter, Jeff Pilson from Dokken and Now Foreigner, and Brian Vanderrock from the Verve Pipe. I met most of these people. They're really cool. But I remember the scene well. Very fond in my heart. Coming in at number 3. Rock and roll movies don't get much better than this because it was a mockumentary parody of rock and roll in itself. This is Spinal Tap, and that is the correct title. This is Spinal Tap. Not just Spinal Tap, but this is Spinal Tap. What else can I say about this movie? It's awesome. I saw it for the first time in the theater in 1984 when I was quite hungover from my senior prom the night before, so plenty of memories of that. Coming in at number 2, a movie that is along with that next movie and another one that's going to show up later in my personal favorites defines my life pretty much. High Fidelity, starring John Cusack. Yeah, I've lived this movie, folks. Definitely. It's a great film. Yeah, what else can I say about that one too? It's great. And by overwhelming votes, the number 1 rock and roll / music movie as chosen by all of you, Almost Famous, directed by Cameron Crowe again. It's basically more or less kind of the story of his life growing up, but you know, different band. They made up fictional bands to cover the real bands and made up fictional characters to play his role. But it's pretty much his story as well. And yeah, I lived this one too. Maybe not to quite the same extent as Cameron did, but I got my chance to be not as young as Cameron was, but a young guy interviewing rock bands and stuff, and it was awesome. So that is the top 10 rock and roll movies as chosen by you. For the sake of shortness, and because this is already running long as it is, I'm going to do a couple more clips where I'm going to reveal like my top 10 rock and roll, which is pretty close to this, as well as some awesome other rock and roll movies that maybe you've never seen that you should check out because they're pretty cool. And then we will be back later, tune in a little bit later on to see that. Catch you later, Sittin' Folks.